So far we've talked about the protons in an atom. This is what defines the element. That will always stay consistent for each element. We've talked about neutrons and how isotopes are different forms of the same element, just different numbers of neutrons. So now we're going to talk about the electrons. And if you recall, this is what we saw were in the electron shells that were around the nucleus. So the protons and the neutrons, they're going to be found in the nucleus, and the electrons will be found in the electron shells. They have a particular order. In those electron shells, and we're only going to talk about the first three, but there are up to 7 that we know of. The first shell, where I have n equals 1, can hold at most 2 electrons. It may have 1, it could have 2. The second and third shells can hold up to 8 electrons. So they can have anywhere between 1 and 8 electrons. This idea that the second and third shells carry 8 electrons or up to is what is known as the octet rule. So in that arrangement also, we will always fill a shell starting with the first one before we move to the next shell. So for instance, if an atom were to have 5 electrons, the first 2 of those would have to go into the first shell to fill it, then the next 3 would all be in the second shell. Not until we get 8 in that second shell will we move on to the third. So that's a general rule for what we're talking about for biology. Now if you do go on to take chemistry, you will talk about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th shells, and there are different rules beyond that. But for the purposes of biology, you just need to know the 2, 8, and 8. And one more special term that's very important, and this is going to help us understand how these different atoms will make bonds in a minute. The valence shell is going to be the outermost electron shell that has electrons. So in the example I gave a minute ago with 5 electrons, if 2 were in the first and 3 are left in the second, then the second shell would be the valence shell. So the valence shell is not always going to be number 2, it is always going to be the last one, the highest number that has electrons.